Well, this is pretty good, Paul, you think? Great. And this is a present from my amazing producer, Jennifer. Thank you so much. Brought that with me. So I'm in this vast and sterile laboratory, the size of a couple of football fields, and I've been stripped of my cell phone and my camera, given a hairnet to wear, and told to behave myself as I walk among these white-coated researchers hunched over their chemistry sets and conveyor belts. And I'm not in some top secret munitions lab. I'm at Kellogg's in Battle Creek, Michigan. And I'm not there to help them engineer some new cracker or taste a new cereal. I'm there because of salt. I'm a journalist just starting a new book on processed foods. And overnight, it seems, suddenly salt has become this gigantic evil, especially the amounts of salt in processed foods. High blood pressure, heart disease, obesity, salt has become the #1 public menace. And for me, I'm like really torn by that because after fat, salt is my go-to craving. I actually secretly once built an entire family vacation around visiting a factory of the Route 11 potato chip company in the Shenandoah Valley. And those free samples were heaven. So I sent a note to Kellogg's and some of the other food giants, and I said, hey guys, what's up with all the salt you're using? And surprisingly, Kellogg's got back to me and said, hey, come on in, we'll talk to you. Well, they did a lot more than talk. I was met at the entrance by the chief technical officer who's in charge of all things scientific, and by the chief spokeswoman who's in charge of all things public image. And as we're walking through the factory laboratory floor, the first thing that hits me is this one-of-a-kind, sweet, right out of childhood scent. Somebody somewhere in there is cooking Pop-Tarts, and I am wheeled back to being a 10-year-old latchkey kid with Gilligan's Island and my favorite flavor, strawberry Pop-Tarts. But then comes the real surprise. The chief technical officer goes, hey, Michael, I've had some of my people whip up some of our biggest sellers, except this time we left out the salt. As we go in this room, sit at a table, there's bowls and trays with different foods on them, and each one has this little label titled normal and without salt. And we start with the normal Cheez-Its, which frankly I could eat all day long. But then we go to the saltless ones, and we can't even swallow them. They stick to the roofs of our mouths because, as Chief Technical Officer explains, salt provides texture and solubility. Next, we move to the frozen Eggo waffles, put them in the toaster, and the saltless ones come out looking and tasting like straw. Salt, explains the Chief Technical Officer, provides color and taste. And finally, we turn to the cornflakes themselves. Put them in the bowl, add some milk, take a big spoonful. And before I can say anything, the chief spokesman, who's in charge of all company image, gets this look of horror on her face, swallows and blurts out the word metal. I taste metal, M-E-T-A-L. And I go, same here. In fact, I had this image of one of my own metal fillings coming out and sloshing around in my mouth with the milk. And I mean, I'm sort of, and I say, I didn't even know cornflakes had salt in them. And Chief Technical Officer goes, oh yeah. And one of the beautiful things about salt for us in this case is that it will negate or mask some of the off notes, bad tastes, that are inherent to many processed foods. And as he goes on waxing poetic about the million miracles that salt does for processed foods, I'm thinking, really? Salt? That rock that costs 10 cents a pound? And at this point I'm thinking, I don't think they brought me here with evil intentions to give me this lesson in salt. And in fact, I don't even see the processed food industry as this evil empire that intentionally set out to make us hugely overweight or otherwise ill. These are companies doing what all companies want to do, which is to make as much money as possible by selling as much product as possible. And these scientists here are bearing their souls to me about how for them making money means using gobs of salt to make their products low cost, convenient, and utterly irresistible. But for me, this is like a fucking journalist's nightmare, because I leave Kellogg's and I'm thinking my heart is like going mushy, because I'm thinking these guys are like really screwed. I mean, they can take a little bit of salt out of their products, but take too much and they're going to lose some of that huge iconic flavor that makes these products sort of these American cultural soul and memories, and they're going to end up with nothing, poof, gone, vanish. And I'm thinking too that this is like a nightmare for me too. And even Pop-Tarts need salt. I mean, Pop-Tarts without salt is like wine without a corkscrew, or pancakes without syrup, or hey, I was raised a Catholic. It's like the Holy Trinity without the Holy Ghost. And frankly, today, I still don't quite know what the Holy Ghost did in that whole equation. But after Kellogg's, I knew what salt did for them. But for me, this feeling of sympathy, if not sorriness for the food giants, was a disaster, and I might as well return that big, fat advance that Random House had given me for the book. And I'm thinking, this is the most horrible situation in the world. And it was several weeks later, and I'm still in total despair. I've even sort of forgotten the most powerful part of salt for these companies. I mean, privately, when they're talking to each other, they talk about salt as having the flavor burst. It's typically on snacks on the outside. The first thing that touches your tongue dissolves in the saliva, hits those taste bud receptors, which sends that incredible signal to the reward center of the brain, which sends back the pleasure signal that says, Michael, love that, keep eating. And I'm forgetting that. I'm going, yeah, but what about all the innocent things that salt does? Yeah, sure, but what about the texture and the solubility and the color and the shelf life? So a few weeks later, I'm in this despair on the train to Philadelphia, home of this magical scientific institution called the Monell Chemical Senses Center. Outside, there is this gigantic sculpture, golden, of a person's face, except they just show the nose and the mouth, because inside are these scientists doing all these crazy experiments to try to figure out why it is we love food. And I have a little trepidation about the place, because a fair amount of their money comes from these same colossal brands that I'm looking into. And when I ask questions, I'm thinking, I'm going to get some really soft answers back here. But to the contrary, almost because of that funding, the scientists themselves make up for it by being even more independent and more strident. One of my favorite people there ended up to be Julia Minella, a biopsychologist, explaining to me how babies are born being sugar junkies. And then she matter-of-factly describes to me how the industry, food industry, the center's funders, exploit her world, the biology of the child, by traipsing around the grocery store, adding sugar to things that didn't used to be sweet. Bread, yogurt, pasta sauces, which builds this expectation in kids that everything should be sweet. So when you drag their little butts over to the produce aisle and try to get them to eat something, with a taste of one of those other 5 basic tastes that Aristotle wrote about, like bitter, forget about it. But salt is different, the resident expert explained to me. We're not even born liking salt. And he gets out these pictures of babies to show me. The baby eating salt has this big, funny smile on her face. And the baby getting the salty taste is like all scowl. And you know, there's nothing like baby pictures to make an incredible point. And my heart starts to steel. But there's more, because Monell has done this study where they looked at two groups of kids. And kids who are fed a typical salty grocery store diet starting at 6 months of age are much more apt than kids who are fed home, mushy vegetables and fruits without anything else. Much more apt to be licking the salt shaker by the time they're in preschool. And I can totally relate to that because we caught my firstborn son doing that same thing about that time in a pizzeria. But more importantly for me and the book, what that meant was that when it came to salt, the industry wasn't just exploiting our biology. It was training us to like salt. It was creating a biology. It was creating this idea in us that we needed lots and lots of salt. And for me, this is a moment of truth. I'm getting up there in years, and that doctor hasn't called yet with the complaint about high blood pressure. But here's my strategy. I've decided to sort of whittle out of my diet as much of that hidden salt processed food stuff as I can, doing things like cooking oatmeal instead of pouring cornflakes, making my own pasta sauce, and I'm figuring that leaves enough room in my reasonably healthy diet for stuff that should be salty, stuff that vacations are made of, stuff that comes from incredible factories with great tours and samples like potato chips. Thank you.